And welcome to another edition of Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN, presented by PointsBet. There's Gord in beautiful suburban Vancouver. Mike joins us from the mothership, and I'm Jim on Football Island as we get ready to roll the 2-minute offense. Penn State with a comfortable win over Auburn. Really only one Canadian to talk about here, and that's Jonathan Sutherland, the super senior, with 2 fumble recoveries and a pair of tackles. Ohio, Iowa State. Curtis Rourke had good numbers until you got to the INTs. 3 picks, did manage almost 200 yards passing and a TD. Nick Mardner getting on track with Cincinnati in their win. 3 receptions this time. First multiple reception game since the transfer. 47 yards and a tutty. Kavaius Robinson with his first sack of the year added 2 tackles as well in Ole Miss's blanking of Georgia Tech. Keelan White with his first touchdown reception of the year as Montana easily cruises by those Sycamores of Indiana State. Arkansas State at Memphis, and a big day for Malik Striker. 12 tackles, a forced fumble, and 1.5 TFLs. Jeffrey Cantonar-Coup for victorious Memphis. He had 5 tackles and a half a TFL. North Carolina Central hands it to New Hampshire, but Joey Corcoran from Quebec had a big day. 7 receptions and 81 yards. Maine losing to Boston College 38-17, but Justin Sambu, big defensive lineman, transferred from UConn. He has 3 tackles, a sack, and 2 quarterback hurries. Merrimack and Harvard, and this one went to overtime, and a big reason for it was Jack Zergiotis. The Quebecer went 23 of 43 for 294, and he was responsible for the Warriors' 3 TDs through the air. Some new names in the highlight reel. What are the biggest surprises of week 3, Mike?
I'll throw a name at you. How about Malik Striker from Arkansas State? He's a kid from the football factory in Brampton. He started his post-secondary career at Carleton before transferring down to A-State. He had 12 tackles last week against Memphis. He was all over the field, had a forced fumble in that game as well. He's got 20 tackles through the first 3 games. There's not much to him. He's not even 6 feet tall. He's barely 200 pounds, but he's got that instinct to see ball, get ball, and boy, Arkansas State really reaping the benefits from a guy that we really haven't talked about much at all over the last couple of years.
Well, one guy I want to talk about is Jack Zergiotis, and that's a name that if you've been watching this show religiously over the last couple of years, you may recognize. Former starter at UConn, he started a few games there for the Huskies before ultimately losing his job and transferring out, and he's now at Merrimack College, which is down at the FCS level, and had an excellent game this past weekend as Merrimack went in to play Harvard and took them to overtime, coming up just a little bit short. But Zergiotis, the completion percentage not super high at 23 for 43, but he throws for 294 and accounts for all 3 touchdowns for the Warriors as they take the Harvard Crimson to overtime. And over the last couple games, he's now up to 6 combined touchdowns and 0 combined interceptions. And when he was at UConn, one of his challenges was that he just turned the ball over a little bit too much when he was on the field. So in this last couple games, that trend has changed. And if he can continue taking care of the football, then he can really build on that and continue to be the entrenched starter for an FCS squad, and a guy that maybe we start to hear more of in places like CFL circles as Canadian quarterbacks continue to slowly gain momentum and a foothold at the pros.
We're going to do things a little differently this week. We want to hear from you two where you think our Canadian athletes are in the NCAA, but first we have to present the Stateside 5. We'll give number 5 to Johnny on the spot Sutherland at Penn State. The super senior had a nose for the ball with 2 fumble recoveries. It's Nick Mardner into the 5 for the first time in Cincinnati this year. 3 receptions and a TD as the Ontario native is finally getting targeted. Jared Wayne leading Pitt in receiving for a 3rd consecutive week gets him in this slot. 3 receptions for 94 yards, but he only did it in 1 half. If you think there wasn't a quality Canadian QB this week, you don't know Merrimack Jack. Zergiotis goes for 294 and 3 TD in an OT loss at Harvard. And how can you deny A-State's Malik Striker from the number 1 spot in the 5? a dozen tackles, a forced fumble, 1.5 tackles for loss for the U Sports transfer. There you see the 10 names selected for the stateside 5 so far this year. Some names that we've talked about for years, some names that we've just started talking about in this episode that were not on the Cornish watch list. Are you surprised by that, Mike?
I don't think there are any huge surprises there. The two guys that we thought maybe would rise to the top have, well, risen to the top. I just like those other guys, though, that we don't want to forget about, because we're going to be talking about, running back, receiver. I'll hearken this back to when we started watching Oklahoma State on a regular basis. We'd tune in to watch Chuba Hubbard, and there's that Amen Ogbogbemiga guy. There's that Shane Richards guy. They're both Canadian, they're both really good, and now all three are playing pro football. If you tune in to see what Chase Brown is all about, don't go out for a beverage and some nachos when the defense comes on the field. Watch his brother, Sidney. He doesn't play the sexiest of positions in terms of racking up statistics, but he's going to be solid. He's averaging about 5 tackles a game. He's a good hitter. He's really good against the run. And I just don't want people to kind of lose that guy. When you tune in to see his brother, you don't forget about Sidney on the other side of the football. And he's getting some love in the stateside 5, which I'm really appreciative of.
And one guy that I think appears to have quite a bit of momentum right now, though he did leave his game this past weekend with an injury, so hopefully that doesn't slow him down for too long, is Jared Wayne over at Pitt. And before he left that game in the first half, he already had 3 receptions for 94 yards. So he has continued to really establish himself as, like I said last week, if not the guy for the Pittsburgh Panthers offense, then one of the guys for them. And given that he had a third-string quarterback starting this game this past weekend, that's a really intriguing stat line in limited action for Wayne. So we'll see how long his potential injury may sideline him. They host Rhode Island this upcoming weekend, but if he can get back on the field in short order, I think this is a guy with a little bit of helium in this process that may actually challenge right at the top for it.
Coming up, a whole lot of rock fighting north of the border. 7,400 people turned up at Mosaic Stadium to see the Battle of Saskatchewan, but would they get their money's worth? We'll tell you about it in our 3-minute warning. Saskatchewan at Regina, 7,400 at Mosaic Stadium showed up, but the offense sure didn't. Regina's Deshaun Mims hauled in a pass from Noah Peltier. 29 yards later, it would be the only TD of the game. 19 punts and 4 field goals resulted in an 11-10 Husky win. UBC scored field goals and safeties. Manitoba scored touchdowns. You know what happens then. Descatelier found Zach Wynn on a 30-yard strike, and Ishe Montanga on a 5-yard major, a much-needed win for the Herd. Alberta shot out to a 33-8 halftime lead, and it was in the bag after 30 at McMahon. Eli Hetlinger went 24 of 33 for 348, threw for 2 TDs, ran in for another for those Golden Bears. Concordia wearing the retro Loyola uniforms, and the Stingers did their history proud against McGill. The old Olivier Waugh was back, 352 yards passing, and he scampered for 2 tutties. The X-Men did all their heavy lifting in the first half, going up 19-1 at Bishops. Silas Finan throwing for 208. X-Men make easy work of the Gators on the road. Ottawa is for real, and there is trouble at Moo U. Ben Miracle tossed for 303 and 3 touchdowns, but the GG success was on the ground. Amakar Polk and JP Simikinda both going over 100 yards. Mac really needed this, a blowout and shutout win in Waterloo. The Marauders dominated every aspect of this one. First downs, 31-9. Total offense, 486 to 160. Mac gets their first win for the second time this year. Hey, guess what? We have another blowout for you. Quentin Scott led the way for Laurier on the ground with 172 yards and a TD. York's only win this year, a forfeit over McMaster. Carleton and Queens, both teams are 2-1 after this one, but it's the Gales who wear it much better. James Keenan with 364 passing and 4 TDs. Maybe the Gales responded to the 7,000 plus in attendance at Richardson. Toronto down the road in Windsor. The Blues opened the scoring, but then it was all Lancers. They would answer with 37 points. Here's the story. Total offense, 479 to 157, and Windsor is in the OUA fight. So some big surprises in the NCAA, as we mentioned before, but some surprises in USports this week as well, and they've been developing for a couple of weeks. What can you say that you honestly did not see coming, Mike?
I didn't see Ottawa coming, not to the extent that Ottawa has produced. You know, the first week they take on Windsor, they win by 3, and people went, okay, they're going to be in the middle of the pack again, as people probably short-sold what Windsor was going to be all about. And then they lost to Queens, and everybody went, oh, okay, they were supposed to lose to Queens. But then they beat Mac, and then they blow out Guelph, and it's more the way they did it that gives me a little bit more optimism than maybe I had at the beginning of the season. They really established the running game. They had 2 guys, both Simonkinda and Polk went over 100 yards. And when that happens, that really sets up the play action for Ben Miracle. And I don't think of, Ottawa as being, Air Miracle going deep all the time, but they had 2 touchdowns of 30-plus yards, which really seems to go against what they want to do as an offense. So not the fact that they're winning, but the way that they won that last game really caught me off guard, and kudos to Marcel Belfay and his staff.
And it's worth noting with Ottawa, too, their only loss thus far was a bit of a weird game. They played Queens really tight, which is also one of the top teams in the OUA. That game was delayed by weather, ended up going really late into the evening, and they lose a close one. So a really impressive start for the GGs. And I'm going to look at another team with just 1 loss out west that I think is a bit of a pleasant surprise so far, and that's the Alberta Golden Bears. Now, this past weekend's result, I would say maybe less of a surprise for Alberta and more of a surprise for the now 0-3 Calgary Dinos. But the Golden Bears, aside from a narrow road loss at UBC on opening weekend, have been really rolling this year. And a guy I think we need to be talking quite a bit more about on the show is Eli Hetlinger, the starting quarterback there. Last 2 weeks, Hetlinger has combined for 10 total touchdowns, both on the ground and through the air, and just 1 interception, as he has been vaulting himself into the conversation as one of the top quarterbacks in the country. So this is a team that all of a sudden I'm keeping a pretty close eye on. And the thing with Hetlinger, too, I should point out, this guy's formerly a pretty highly regarded recruit. So the talent has always been there, and now he's getting his chance to shine and really taking advantage of it.
If there's been a disappointment in Ontario for me, it's been Waterloo, and not the fact that they're losing, but how they're losing. They came out of the gate, they replaced Trey Ford with Nolan Caban, and he came out, he threw 7 touchdowns and against 1 interception in the first couple of games. But the second game was a real shootout that they ended up losing to Guelph, and then they lose 43-0 at home to McMaster. 84 points in the last couple of games, almost 1,000 yards in offense against. That surprised me because they've done a nice job recruiting over the last couple of years. Chris Bertoya's got a good staff. Daryl Adams will get that hemorrhaging on the defense slowed down a little bit. I don't know how good they can be defensively, but when I saw that score against McMaster, I went, oh boy, did not see that coming.
Coming up, SF. Who? Welcome back. Here are your CJFL standings on the road to the Canadian Bowl. Well, we're accustomed to seeing Simon Fraser eviscerated week after week, and it started in week 1 with a 40-7 loss to Central Washington at home. But the bigger story was that they finally came up with a name, and that name, boys, was Red Leafs. So in Vancouver, are we expected to chant, "Go Leafs, go"?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they go down to the Beagle on West 8th, then they might fit in there. But yeah, it was an interesting name change choice, to say the least. And frankly, I think it was a little bit overthought by the leadership there at SFU. I mean, Highlanders was kind of right there. Something that fits the Scottish heritage of the institution. They happen to be located on, wouldn't you know it, Burnaby Mountain, so one of the highland areas in the Lower Mainland here. It seemed like a perfect fit that was almost too easy, and I guess that's what the leadership decided in going with Red Leafs. Now, I'm not going to say that I love the name change, but I will say that I do completely understand what the university is thinking here and what they are trying to do. They have already really worked to market themselves as Canada's only NCAA team. You know, their conference play now takes them deep into some of the heartlands of the United States. And so carving out their identity as that program that has a different nationality altogether and reinforcing that with the red leaf thing, an image they were already kind of using to market the team over the last couple years, I understand the fit and I see what they're going for. I don't love it, especially the Red Leafs thing. You know, I feel really bad for whichever offensive lineman stuck wearing number 67 for them, but I do understand what the university is trying to accomplish here at least.
Nobody will care if they win. You know, there are so many bad names in sports, and take some of the obvious ones out of the equations that have been changed in the last few years. Red Blacks. Nobody liked the name Ottawa Red Blacks when they came in, and now it's a thing and people wear the red and black plaid and it's a thing and it works and it has worked. Nobody liked Raptors when they came into the league. Nobody liked Blue Jays. Lakers in Los Angeles is a really dumb name. Jazz in Utah is a dumber name. But you know what? They all seem to work when the team wins. So if they win, nobody will care if they have a red leaf on their jersey or their helmet or not. All they want to do or see is wins, and if they can market it, they can sell some jerseys, some t-shirts, some hoodies, and all is good out on the West Coast where, yes, they will be going, go Leafs, go.
There's plenty of good and plenty of bad for Simon Fraser. The good is that they are an associate member of the Lone Star Conference, which is, by some estimates, the top D2 conference in all of the United States. The bad is that they're playing most of their games on the road this year, most of them in Blaine, Washington as home games, and then going down to Texas because of border restrictions. How long can SFU keep this up?
I'm not sure, and I think it kind of depends on how long this lasts. There is still an outside possibility that that changes even this fall, but I would say that it's pretty safe that they'll be playing basically the rest of their home schedule this season in Blaine, just on the other side of the U.S. border. And unfortunately, the timing on that couldn't be worse for the institution. They've just finished their big renovation at Terry Fox Field in the last year. It's a beautiful facility up there now. It looked great last weekend with their one home game they were able to host. I'm glad they were able to get at least one, but that's going to be a big thing for them to be able to get back to their home yard and be visible to the locals, because one of the challenges here is who's going to go down aside from parents to support this team on the other side of the border. It's that added level of hassle. So now you have a season where you're going to have a tough time having anybody in the local area really have eyes on the product themselves to sell it to the next generation of recruits and things like that. So I hope it doesn't set them back too much, but really the bigger picture here is much more than the issue with Blaine. It's much more than the facilities issue on Burnaby Mountain. It's much more than the branding issue. And the bigger picture issue is that since they've moved down to the NCAA, this program has rarely, and I mean very rarely, been competitive. And that is now a fairly long period of time, almost a decade now. And so that is the bigger picture concern here, because their competition isn't getting any easier, and there just doesn't seem to be a lot of football hope on the horizon for the program at the moment. That's something that's going to need to turn around in a hurry, I think, before they end up further lost in the wilderness.
Coming up, the games of the week. Welcome back, everyone. TV and football. And the one thing that we can be guilty of, actually, we can be guilty of a whole bunch of things, but one thing is not talking enough about offensive line prospects, and that ends here, Gord.
Yeah, I strong-armed this one into the rundown, so we got our fix. But we do have a Canadian offensive lineman versus Canadian offensive lineman matchup south of the line as Buffalo takes on Eastern Michigan. Salmon Arm BC's Gabe Wallace starting on the Buffalo offensive line, a guy that looks like a pretty promising prospect with probably a couple years in front of him still at the college level. And then on the other side, C.D. Sow, the Quebecer on the Eastern Michigan offensive line, is a more mature prospect, a guy that was originally in last year's CFL draft pool. He deferred his eligibility to this upcoming year's draft so he could go back to school. And he is starting on an Eastern Michigan line for his third season that is continuing to lead the success for the Eagles, including a stunning upset this past weekend down in Tempe, Arizona at Arizona State. By the way, the PointsBet free money tip of the week, the opening line for Utah and Arizona State this weekend only favors Utah by 5. That should probably be about 3 times that big. So there's your easy money Gord betting tip of the week. But back to this one, Eastern Michigan coming off a huge victory in non-conference play looks to open their schedule. And with the form that the Buffalo Bulls have been in so far this year, lost Lance Leipold a couple years ago and have really struggled to maintain their success since. I think Eastern Michigan probably a safe favorite in this one, but I'm going to be watching for those two on either trench because they are two intriguing Canadian prospects.
I'm going to focus on a game with two Canadian receivers, neither of whom might play this weekend, oddly enough, as we have Rhode Island taking on Pitt. And Jamal Mensah is a guy who's been a little bit of a disappointment, obviously, because he hasn't played yet. He played last year, he played special teams, he had a handful of catches, and we were hoping this would be the year the Coquitlam native would be able to take a step forward and, you know, maybe get on the field a little bit more. But that hasn't been the case. He hasn't dressed for any of the Rams' first three games. No problem in seeing playing time for Jared Wayne in Pittsburgh with Pitt, as long as he's healthy. As Gordon mentioned earlier in the program, he got banged up last week. When he's on, he's really on. The game against Tennessee, a career high 7 catches for the senior. He's been really good this year, probably you know, one of the co-favorites right now for the Cornish. But if he plays, that's great, but we'll see how the injury is and whether or not they decide to rest him against a team in a game that they should win rather easily.
Time for U Sports Games of the Week. Mike, you go first.
Let's go with Ottawa Laurier, two teams that are fighting to be that number 2 seed behind Western in the OUA, and both teams have a legitimate chance of getting there, so this becomes an absolutely huge game. I would think for Laurier the key would be to try and slow down the running attack of Ottawa. If they can do that, that allows them a whole lot of different options to go. If Ottawa can establish the running game, that sets up play action for them, and that's what Miracle does really, really well. From an Ottawa perspective, if they're looking to win this game, I know it's an old cliche, and I can say this about every game at every level, but turnovers. It's been a team that's forced 6 interceptions so far, have forced a fumble that they've recovered as well. So if they can run the football and force some turnovers, it might be a long day for the Golden Hawks.
My U Sports Game of the Week out west here is not 1 but 2. And the bigger question here is, are the 2 Saskatchewan schools starting to pull away from the pack in the Canada West? We can have a pretty good answer for that question this upcoming weekend as the Huskies travel to face the latest potential upstart contender, the aforementioned Alberta Golden Bears in Edmonton this weekend, whereas Regina travels out to the West Coast to play UBC. A road trip that can be tough for teams coming from the prairies. And for Saskatchewan in particular, you know, coming out to start the season, you know, Calgary was a perennial power in the Canada West. They're now 0-3 to start the season. Manitoba was in the Hardy Cup final last year. They stumbled out of the gates. UBC looked like they might be a team on the rise, and with a soggy loss in Winnipeg last weekend, they're now 1-2 out of the gate. So it's really only Alberta left standing, and it's really only Regina who has challenged them so far. So it'll be interesting to see if Alberta can give them a run at least, maybe even pull off a victory, and make this a little bit more intriguing at the top. Because if they can't, I would say that there's a very clear 1-2 right now after 4 weeks in the Canada West. And with Regina coming out west, they're going to have to weather that trip, weather what is still a talented UBC squad on their home field, and really entrench themselves as that top challenger like they looked to be last week. So a couple really intriguing matchups for both those Saskatchewan schools this weekend on the road.
For everyone on Krown Gridiron Nation, Krown Produce, PointsBet, and our entire team, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to the game.